Thank you for joining us today. Today we are interviewing Dr. Bob Heinich in Colorado Springs, Colorado, at the District 11 School Media Services building. And today is December the 11th, 2012. And Bob, thank you for joining us for the interview.
Oh, a pleasure. I know we'll be delighted with the outcome.
I hope so. We will be. We really appreciate your participation in the History Makers Project for AECT.
Glad to participate.
Thank you. And so we'll get started by having you tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, you know, I got into this field through my hobbies, really. This is before World War II. When I was in high school, I lived in Flushing, but I went to high school in Lower Manhattan, which is Stuyvesant High School. And during the elevator train rides, I met a fellow student who had the same kind of passion for poetry that I did. And so we'd often get together and do recitations. Then we decided that the recitations really should be recorded for posterity. And we hunted around and we found a music teacher, had a music shop, and in the back of the shop he had a little recording studio, and he had a disc recorder. Now in those days, the only recordings that were made on disc directly, and the records were actually cut. It was a very painstaking process, but in any event, we would rent the place from him and do these recitations, you know, and the poems that we've read and the short stories and so on were the ones that high school students would go for. Mostly Edgar Allan Poe. I remember doing a complete recording of the Cask of Amontillado, and so on. And then we got interested in film. And film at that time, that is films of unusual interest and so on, were not shown in the regular theaters. You had these small movie houses. And we used to go to the Fifth Avenue Playhouse just below 14th Street on Fifth Avenue, and we'd see films like Buñuel and Dolly's Un Chien Andalou, Jean Cocteau's Blood of a Poet and his Beauty and the Beast, Joris Ivan's film Spanish Earth, and so on. And then the war intervened. And so we were off to the Army. After I got discharged in 1946, I went up to Greeley to Colorado State College and to enroll. And I found out that there was a department that used films and so on, and recordings, and did all of this audiovisual stuff that I had gotten a kick out of when I was in high school. And so I asked if they had a job there where I could be a student assistant and so on. And that's when I met Jim Finn, who's one of the more famous names in this field, and a number of other people who eventually, like Lou Forsdale, who became very well known. And that sort of segued me from my hobbies into what I was going to do professionally. Now, when I signed up for the GI Bill, you had to specify what your ultimate goal was going to be. Well, I said mathematics teacher in college. Well, I soon abandoned that and decided that what I really wanted to do was work in this field where you could have films, recordings, radio, no television yet. And so really, my hobbies sort of led me directly into my vocation.
And, well, that segues really nicely into having you talk about your career path.
Oh, okay. Yes. And I wanted to major in this field, as I said up there, but there wasn't any such thing. But I majored in secondary education. And the only reason why I did that is that it allowed me more flexibility in choosing electives. And all the electives I chose were courses that were taught by Finn and Kilburn in the audiovisual department. And they were not just courses in how to do things and so forth, but I remember one of the most memorable courses that Finn, I'll get it straight, that Finn used to teach was a course in general communications. Educations in Propaganda, it was called. And it was a very informative and mind-opening sort of course. Well, anyhow, then when I graduated with a master's degree in 1949, I got a call from Colorado Springs asking me in for an interview for a job there, recommended by Finn. And so I came down to Colorado Springs, met with Superintendent Watson, and by the end of the interview, I was an employee of School District Number 11. And I founded this department whose facilities we are now using. Except, of course, it was a lot smaller. Now, of course, with the equipment that they have, it's really an impressive facility. And so I was in Colorado Springs for 13 years. In 1962, we moved to California, and I started a PhD program under Finn, who is now at USC. And we were there for 4.5 years. And when I graduated, I found out all of a sudden that I was awarded the Dissertation of the Year from the School of Education, which later became the basis of a monograph that I did for AECT. And so in 1966, in August of 1966, I was nearing the end of my doctoral studies when I got a call from an executive search agency wanting to know if I would be interested in creating a media division within a large publishing house. I asked which publishing house, and they said, well, you'll find that out later. We want an expression of intent. If you are interested, write us a letter, and then we'll go from there. So I said, yes, I was interested. And about 4 weeks later, I got another call, and it was from an executive in Doubleday, and it turned out that Doubleday was the large book publisher that wanted to start a media program. And so I was interviewed by them in January of '67, and then hired on the basis of that interview. So during the next 2 years, I spent my time commissioning and developing films, film strips, reading materials, supplementary readers, and a number of other items of educational, instructional use. And I really had not intended to make that my career, but I did want the experience, which I did. Then I published the monograph, and Ole Larson at Indiana University read the monograph, was very much impressed with it, and called and asked if I would be interested in joining the faculty. And after some delay occasioned by events that were going on within Doubleday, I said yes, and I joined the Indiana faculty in 1967 as a full professor. I'd like to mention that the full professor was the only tenure rank that I ever held. I was never an assistant professor. I was never an associate professor. I was hired directly as a full professor. And so at Indiana, taught courses, did other things for the Audiovisual Center until 1990 when I decided to retire. I retired on my 67th birthday in 1990. And after 4 years, 4 years after I retired, we decided to move back to Colorado Springs. And here we are.
Here you are. Well, thank you.
During the time that I was at Indiana, was when I was elected president of AECT. At that time, it was making the transition between DAVI and AECT. And at the same time, we decided to found the ECT Foundation. And I became the first president of that. I was president of the ECT Foundation for 10 years. During that time, the foundation grew rather slowly. Most of the time, we were preoccupied with straightening out the relationships between the association and the foundation. It was very difficult to get over to certain people the necessity for separating the foundation's activities entirely from the association's activities and eliminating any possibility of undue influence, which would have been contrary to the charter that the foundation had with IRS and so on. So those were pretty interesting years.
They were.
So that pretty much, covers the main trail that I went through in this field.
Okay. Well, I'll get you to elaborate a little bit on some of your activities at Indiana. But first, I'd like you to talk a little bit about your monograph. Tell us a little bit about the content and the focus of that.
Well, I should preface this by saying that the main line of inquiry that I've had, and I won't call it research, I'll call it inquiry, really started when I was the audiovisual director in Colorado Springs. And when it started dawning on me that the way in which we were making large-scale collections of films, like an entire course on film, courses by television and so forth, that media could take a much better position in the context of instruction than had been in the past. And the ability to do complete courses and to create, in effect, a whole university or school through media became a distinct possibility. And that idea really stuck with me all through my career. And the monograph, which is based on the dissertation, as I said, supports that and elaborates on it, and posits the notion that by the introduction of technology at certain levels of design, that you're really making a paradigm shift in the way in which education can be structured, instruction can be designed, and so on. And so the monograph really has to do with how changes in technology and changes in schools of thought can shift the entire spectrum of how we look at things. I know that one chapter, for example, is devoted to the place of learning theory, and that learning theory must evolve from being stuck in behaviorism or Gestalt. And really, the chapter is about the oncoming information theory of learning, of something more elaborate and more contextual than, say, Gestalt or behaviorism. And the second chapter had to do with how paradigms change and why they change, and that they often are a disconnect with what has gone before. So that you don't get a continuous movement from A to B. It's an interrupted one, and it's a shift going from A to C. So, and the conclusion of the monograph really is an illustration of why our field is faced with that type of situation at that time. Of course, now we're talking about 1967, 68, 69, the period of time when the monograph was in the dissertation stage.
Okay, all right. And how did that work lead into your area of inquiry at Indiana? Did you elaborate on it from there?
Oh, I continued there. In fact, in one of the grants that I had, which was, the proposition was that educational technology required a different management model for education than what we are used to, with the classroom unit as the basis of the school. And that led me into a legal analysis, or I should say an analysis of the legal aspects of school regulation and law that inhibit the use of technology. And the report that I wrote was based on that there were impediments put in place that made it more difficult to use technology on a wide-scale basis. For example, the class size, the fact that everything had to be based on a classroom unit, the way in which finances were distributed for schools. I remember using the illustration that one of the projects during the 60s was a complete course on film by Harvey White from Berkeley in physics. And I used the illustration that if I were to buy that series of films to use in classrooms as a course in physics, that money would have to come out of supplies. If I hired Harvey White to teach that course live in the classroom, his salary would come out of the instructional part of the budget, which is much, much larger. And so just the way in which you paid for things, the way in which they're classified, makes a difference in whether you discourage or encourage it. So that was an important part of the work. The other was looking at how technology impacts institutions and how technology can change institutions. I think at the present time, we're going through some of that with a long-distance education, with computer-based courses that are internet-based, in that they have the potential of dissolving those artificial boundaries that separate the possibilities from what is actually going on in the classroom. So that those initial notions of technology entering into the instructional process at a higher level followed through in all of the things that I talked about at Indiana, and continued to write about. In fact, one of the articles that I did on the proper study of instructional technology has been used many times as an example of how that could be applied. And there was another article, a follow-up article, on that had more to do with the impact on the profession. The article actually was originally in the proper study of instructional technology. But Bill Wynn, who was editing the journal after I left, said that he thought it was too long, and could I shorten the article? And I said, well, I don't want to shorten it, but what I can do is take out that one section. That is, I didn't want to shorten it by here and there, crossing out a word on a sentence. So I said, well, let's excise that one article, and I'll rework it, retitle it, and we'll run it in a future issue, which is what he did. And that article, I think, is really as important as the other one. It has to do with how technology can change professions. and how professions react to technology. And I used illustrations from, well, for example, from military history, where during the Civil War, when steamships were introduced into combat and so forth, and they were very successful, after the war, the Navy went back to sailing ships because the admirals felt more comfortable with that than they did with those belching steam stacks. Anyhow, and that the notion of what the professor is or what the teacher is could be altered by the way in which instruction is delivered. Because, you know, in the university, for example, professors tend to identify themselves with the classroom, with the lecture hall, you know, and so on. Chalk on the back of their coats as they rubbed against the blackboard. And they don't see themselves as being associated with technology.
Well, your work was pivotal in that regard, and I think shifting our focus as a field away from focusing on technology in and of itself to technology as part of a system.
Mm-hmm.
And with regard to your work in that area, in instructional management and informing instructional design and also teacher education, can you talk about your also seminal work in the textbook that's still used very broadly today? Heinich, Melinda, Russell, now Smaldino.
Yeah.
And I know it's changed some since that's how it was when I used it 10 years ago. But talk a little bit about your role in that
Well,
book.
you know, there, as you mentioned, there were three of us involved, myself, Mike Melinda, and Jim Russell. Mm-hmm. And each of us will give you a different story as to how this book came about. But I'll have to set the record straight.
Okay.
In the first place, when I was working with Doubleday, the 2 years in New York, publishing is a very close-knit universe. And I got to be very good friends with a guy at John Wiley. And he knew of my previous work before taking over the job in publishing. And he wanted me to do a book that, well, in effect, it was like the book that Jonathan put together on research history and research articles, practices, trends, etc. And I wasn't really, at that time, particularly interested in that. But later he said, would you like to do a basic textbook in the field? We feel that it's ripe for it. The Dale is out. Whittack and Schuler isn't going anywhere. There are some other paperbacks, but you really need a new text. And so I signed a contract with him to do the text. Well, I happened to be in California at the time on sabbatical when I got a call from Melinda. And during the conversation, Melinda mentioned that Russell had gotten a call from a paperback publisher who wanted to put out a quick and dirty educational media book. And Russell asked Mike if he were interested in it. Well, I made a decision on the spot. I knew I was not going to do this thing all by myself. And so I said to Mike, how would you guys like to go first class? Now, rather than this paperback thing, we got a good publisher, hardback stuff, good editorial support. Why not? And so he called Jim, and then they agreed. So I called Wiley, had the contract altered to include the other two guys, and then we went ahead to putting this thing together. And one of our goals was to make the book intellectually respectable. I mean, the only book that really was, to some extent, was Dale's book, Audiovisual Methods in Teaching, in the chapter that he had on concept learning. Mm-hmm. and that was really worthwhile. Anyhow, so we decided that we would do this book, but we would, as I said, do it in a intellectually honest way, and we did. And I think the reception the book has had panned out and supported the way in which we thought about it right from the beginning. It's now, I think, it's in its 10th edition or something like that. Amazing. That's incredible for a book in the education area.
And what year did you first publish it?
Oh my, was it 80, 81? And I think it was on a 3-year revision cycle. I think it was either 80 or 81.
Okay.
When you get this far along, dates sort of get mangled up.
Well, I used the 3rd edition, I believe, and it served my pre-service teachers very well. And I
Good.
know it's still being used very broadly.
Good. The other anecdote is the different opinions where the Assure model came in.
Okay.
Who thought of that when? And of course, I always swore that I did. On one of the trips from Bloomington to Indianapolis, it suddenly sort of came to me. I mean, it just started falling into place. And so since I'm the one who's being interviewed here, I'm the one who thought of the idea of the Assure
Okay.
model.
We'll check this against Mike Melinda's interview.
Well, his has already been finished. His is finished. You're going to have to put an addendum on it.
Oh, well, okay. We'll let him have another shot.
Yeah, why not? I don't know about Jim. You'd have to slow him down to talk to him about it.
I'll try.
Jim was always the pusher. I mean, he's really
the force.
Yeah. I remember one time talking to Jim Brown in California, and Jim was part of the Brown-Lewis Harkle Road. That was the other edition that went into more than one edition. I mean, it had about 4 or 5. And I was talking to Jim, and he asked, well, who's going to be doing this text with you? And I said, well, Jim Russell. And he said, well, if Jim's in it, it'll finish. You'll get it done. And I believe it. It was an interesting team. Mike really never wanted to get the thing off the drawing board. He liked working on it. And he just couldn't get to part with it, to give it to the publisher and say, now it's ready, Jim, on the other hand, liked to get it done, and he wanted it done. He was more like James Thurber's comment that don't get it right, get it published. And so I was sort of in the middle of the three of us, with Mike being recalcitrant, Jim wanting to push ahead, and I had to balance a bunch.
You're the mediator.
Yeah.
Now, in writing that book, what were your primary contributions? Which parts of the content focus did you?
Well, the first chapter, definitely the last chapter, and I think, boy, it's hard to know. I think I did the motion picture chapter, and maybe a couple of others, audio chapter, part of the second chapter, which was where the Assure model came in. And then the instructor's manual.
Okay.
I wanted that to be intellectually worthwhile reading. And so I put a lot of material in there. For example, the discussion of Marshall McLuhan and the importance of the ideas and the concepts that he was noted for. And then the future, the last chapter on the future of the field and so forth, that I had a good deal to do with.
Okay.
But we all pitched in on the chapters, although certain chapters were given to certain people.
Okay. Well, it's had a tremendous impact on our field as well as pre-service teacher education, I know, teacher
Good.
education in general. So thanks for all the good work.
Yeah.
Let's see. What were some of the major ideas or approaches that stimulated your professional growth?
Ideas or approaches? I would say knowing people like Charlie Hoban and Jim Finn. Finn was very important in the field in that he broadened our concept of what we're about in this business. You know, he was the push behind getting the research journal started in the first place.
And which journal was that?
The Audiovisual Communication Review, AVCR, which later became then the Education Community. What's it called now?
ETR&D?
Oh.
Educational Technology Research and Development.
Oh, okay, very good. Good title. And Charlie Hoban was one of the most knowledgeable guys in the field, not very well known amongst a number of people, but he was a major contributor to the analysis and codification of research in this field in the early days. He did a very, very good job. He also had written a book called Visualizing the Curriculum, which in it contained the basic diagram that Dale later expanded into the cone of experience.
Okay.
And Charlie was one of those guys who was a very bright intellectual, but with a lousy sense of direction sometimes. I mean, in other words, he could have capitalized on that visualizing the instruction, but never did. You know, let it slide to do some other things. And Dale picked it up and made a going thing out of it.
Right.
With his audiovisual methods in teaching. Incidentally, in the last edition of his book, he footnotes me in a chapter and referring to something that I had written, and by name footnoted me in the book. I always was pleased with that.
Edgar Dale?
Yeah,
Oh, okay.
yeah, Dale's book. So, getting back to the foundation, one thing I really regret about the years with the foundation is that we didn't have as many fundraisers as we should. And we spent too much time on internal matters and not enough time on promoting the thing. I remember when Dick Lewis and Jerry Kemp got together and put together a film strip on promoting the foundation that they designed, and properly so, to be given to the president, for example, whenever he goes around making speeches to the various state associations. He should always use that promotional film strip. But I doubt if it ever really got used that much. And later on, now when DeKeefer took over, after I left, DeKeefer was more of a promoter. Mm-hmm. And he and Woody Miller from Colorado did a lot of promotional work, and very good promotional work, to build up the funds and the coffers.
Good. That's good history.
But I remember sitting with the guy from UCLA, Dean McCluskey, on a ride from Denver to Boulder, talking him into parting with $10,000 for that scholarship that is in his name now.
That we still give today.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for that.
Yeah.
So you're still making an impact.
Yeah.
That's great. Now, you've talked a little bit about this already, but here's an opportunity to elaborate maybe and mention some other people. But one of the questions is, who are some of the people who have had the most impact on your professional growth?
Yeah, I mentioned Finn and Hoban. I got to know Charlie very well. He was a very human guy. And he was at the University of Pennsylvania. In fact, Dick Clark studied under him for a while at Penn. And then Finn, of course. Finn was a very imposing character. First place, he was about 6'3", and used his height to his advantage all the time. He loved getting close and looking down in an intimidating manner.
Can't do that.
But we were very close. As I said, our association started in the end of 1946, beginning of 1947. And we were friends for a long time. And he was most inspiration. It's hard for me to think of others. I've known other people whose work I've admired, like Len Silverne, very smart in program instruction and so forth. Louise Benton, or rather Louise Wagner, who contributed so much to the organization. I was friends with her for some time. Oh, Bill Allen, for his work in research. So they were, and Ole Larson, I can't forget Ole Larson. Ole was head of the Indiana program in fact, he started it, built it up, and had a very large supporting apparatus there. I mean, he supported so many graduate students in the audiovisual department, in the film library that they had, in the production facilities that they had. He had the whole thing on a revolving funding basis. And the way that started was right after World War II, probably about 1947 or 8, the president of Indiana University, Wells, was going to be going to Washington on a trip, and Ole learned about it. And so he arranged to get passage on the same train and rode to Washington with Wells and convince him that he should give him a sufficient grant that he could start this library and make it self-supporting. And he did. I mean, he got the money, built it up, made it self-supporting, and as a result was able to expand and hire all those graduate students and therefore build up the program. And Indiana at that time was the largest program in the field, and it was all due to Ole. Only I have to tell kind of an anecdote about Ole on myself. When Ole hired me and got me on board as full professor, half of my duties were supposed to be with the Audiovisual Center. Well, Ole and I had different opinions on how this should work. He wanted me to have a lot of responsibility, but no authority. He wanted to keep the authority. And so we didn't get along very well in that regard. And so when it came time for me to come up for tenure, Ole called me in. We sat down, and after chitty-chatting about the situation in the world and all that, Ole said, "Bob, I'm not going to recommend you for tenure." And I said, "Oh, that's okay, Ole." And that was the end of that conversation. And sure enough, he did not recommend me for tenure, but obviously I got tenured. And I really attribute that to Mendel Sherman. That I found out later that Mendel went to bat for me in the School of Ed. and that they did award me tenure. The other factor that was involved was that Ole was about to retire in about another year. And I'm sure that it went through the dean's mind and anyone else who was involved in the higher echelons that if Ole was going to stay on for any period of time, the rancor that would have been caused between us would not be a good thing. But if he's only going to be there for a year, if this guy's worth it, then keep him and let Ole retire unhappy. Or, well, I don't know if Ole retired unhappy, but anyhow. But it went through, and so I was awarded tenure. But it was an interesting moment.
Wow. What were some of the most important trends in the field during your career?
Well, of course, remember, you know, my career started in '49, so it started pre-television. And radio and film and so forth, photography and graphics were the main part of the field. Well, then that meant that I witnessed the introduction of television. Television came in, made a big splash, videotape, etc. And then, of course, then program instruction came in. Then the computer started making itself felt, both in computer managed instruction. In fact, it was at first mainly in computer managed instruction. I mean, using it in that sense, not in the delivery of instruction. Later, of course, it became delivery of instruction. And that came in and made a vast change. Then, of course, as a result of both television and computers, we had the distance learning efforts, or whatever you call it now. And so, and then the introduction of enough internet work that, as I said before, we're starting to erode those boundaries between the units in education, doing away with artificial concepts of classroom, school, etc. We'll always have them, of course, and they'll always be important, but there will also be this other framework allowing much more flexibility in how these things are delivered. The only thing that I worry about is if it gets scattered too much, will it maintain quality? I mean, I think quality control is one of the main issues in distance education and internet type education.
Well, you're not alone in that concern. A lot of people feel that way.
And the other is maintenance. Well, that's part of quality control, but maintenance. You know, it's easy enough to design the course, put it in its format, but then 2 years later it needs to be revised. Well, who's going to take the responsibility for doing the revision? Or something needs to be corrected. Something needs to be added. Is there continuing supervision of that, or do we treat it as a one-shot deal? I think that's going to be a crucial issue.
You're right. Yeah, it is. Okay. What do you think has been the greatest accomplishment of your career and why? Easy question.
My 13 years as editor of the Journal. Well, I suppose from an outside point of view, I mean, in other words, someone not knowing anything about this and looking at what is there would probably say being named a distinguished alumnus by the University of Northern Colorado as a trailblazer in the field.
And you have been.
I was very pleased with that.
That's wonderful. So I have one last question for you.
Okay.
How would you like to be remembered within our profession?
Oh, someone who opened the door, who showed a different way, who, you know, saw the field for more than these individual little pieces, and that it can make a whole. And I think my insight into the nature of the uses of, well, I could say power within the field, that's something that is underrated. I'll have to mention the other aspect of that interests me in technology and its impact on institutions is its impact on the roles people play. And the way in which we look at teaching as a sociological function. The sociology of teaching in relation to technology, I think, is fascinating. And we could learn a lot from sociology and certain aspects of sociology and apply it to our situations. For example, in a little book called The Presentation of Self in Everyday Life by Irving Goffman, he mentions that a category of people we call non-people, there are things like waitresses, bartenders, policemen, bus drivers. I mean, people who are important functioning roles, but you don't pay attention to them. They're kind of non-existent. And when you use films extensively in a classroom, for example, very often we treat the teacher as a projectionist. It becomes a non-person in the scheme of things, and that's resented, and rightfully so. It's very silly to do it that way. For example, and then it results in sometimes a teacher striking back. During that heyday of making filmed courses, the course in physics was used throughout Wisconsin. This was Wittick's bailiwick. I mean, he was in charge of this project of showing the Harvey White physics films and the whole state of Wisconsin. And the usual question, can the films teach the course as well as, bump, bump, bump. Lousy question, but anyhow. But the interesting part about that experiment was the sort of on-the-side discussion of teachers' reactions to the use of the films in the classroom. For example, some teachers showed the films deliberately out of focus. Some teachers showed the film without the sound being on all the time. I mean, in other words, there were these odd cases of sabotage. I'm not saying it was universal, I'm just saying these things happened. And we had this case of sabotage because teachers resented the intrusion of these things into their classrooms. And I don't blame them, I'd react the same way. So it's that type of thing where, for example, let's take the overhead projector. The overhead projector was accepted very readily by teachers. I mean, there's one piece of technology that I loved. Why? It's an extension of the blackboard. It's their power station. Now, if you introduce closed circuit television or some other comprehensive means of technology, the resentment is there many times because they feel they are not a part of that process. So that whole area of the relationship between technology and the individuals. So that whole area of the relationship between technology and the individuals in the teaching process, I think is understudied and so on.
I think you've just given some of our grad students some fodder for future research.
Oh,
Yeah.
I would urge them on it, yeah.
Would you like to make any parting remarks?
Oh, I don't know, outside of the fact that I enjoyed this very much. And I hope it's of use to somebody.
I know it will be. Well, thank you, Bob, for joining us here today. We really appreciate your contribution to AECT and to this project.
Well, thank you.
Thank
I
you.
enjoyed it.